this lecture, I'm going to be bringing together all that we've learned about regression to talk about how we interpret our findings when we finally get them. How do we understand what a regression table means? So to do through this, I'm going to talk through an example. And this is from an article by Boulding and Nelson Nunez. And they look at the question of whether participation in civil society organizations leads people to support democratic institutions. And in fact, they have a hypothesis that it's the opposite, that participation in civil society organizations could actually undermine support for democratic institutions during periods of political crisis. They come up with this hypothesis based on their studies of Latin America. And so here this picture is from Bolivia in the water wars of 2000. And Boulding and Nelson Nunez are looking at Bolivia in 2000 and a series of other crises in the region. And they have this theory that while somebody like Putnam would say that participating in civil society organizations is going to strengthen democracy, maybe in certain periods where there's a lot of political turmoil, participating in a civil society organization can make people more likely to adopt contentious strategies that reject the very legitimacy of democratic institutions and democratic outcomes. So here in this water war in Bolivia, they're protesting the privatization of water, but they're not just protesting that outcome, that policy outcome. They're actually questioning the very legitimacy of those who are elected and the authority of democratic institutions to speak for the people. So in this sort of really tumultuous political period, maybe participation in these civil society organizations would actually undermine support for democratic institutions. So they want to test this relationship to see if there's any evidence that there is a causal relationship. So remember, for multivariate regression, we're trying to estimate the effect of x on y by controlling for confounds. Bivariate regression just looks at the effect of x on y, but maybe there are other factors out there, other potential confounds that make the relationship between x and y appear spurious. And so that's why we want to move to multivariate regression. So the equation for multivariate regression with control variables is the same here as with bivariate regression. So the dependent variable y is equal to the constant plus this is the coefficient times x, so that's the independent variable. And then these are all the other confounds that we're going to be controlling for, plus this residual or error term. So what does this mean for our example of civic participation and support for democratic institutions? So here, dependent variable y, support for democratic institutions. The independent variable, which we are calling x1, is participation in a civil society organization. I have that labeled as a CSO. And then they look at a series of different confounds. So one, hypothetically, could be the perception of the economy. So maybe people who participate in civil society organizations happen to be the ones who believe that the economy is doing poorly. That might make them decide to get out of the house and do something to make their communities better. And maybe people who perceive that the economy is doing poorly are going to be less likely to support democratic institutions, but it's not because they participated in the civil society organization. Or likewise, maybe it could be related to the level of education. Maybe people who are less educated are more likely to are less likely to participate in civil society organizations, and they're also less likely to believe that democracy really works. And so you look and you see a relationship between participation and support for democratic institutions, but it's because of this other confound that's at play. So these are two confounds I'll be looking at throughout this presentation, but there are several others that Boulding and Nelson Nunez examined through their regression analysis. So here are their findings, and at first you're probably looking at this and feeling really overwhelmed. There's lots of numbers going on, and it's really unclear what's happening. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm going to take you through this table and show you how to interpret it and how to analyze our findings. So first, I'm deciding how to read a regression table. Let's look at breaking down by rows and columns. So here, rows, well, these reflect the independent and the confounding variables. Okay, so going back to this daunting regression table, we look here, being a member of a church group. Okay, that's a type of participation in a civil society organization. That's part of their main independent variable. And then perception of the economy, that's one of their confounds. Education, that's one of their confounds. So all of these are different potential independent variables. And look down at the bottom. Here's our trusty constant. In general, we don't really pay that much attention to the constant, but it's always going to be there, and it's always going to be at the bottom. And then here is our n. So we see, wow, this is 2,322. It's a pretty large n for this study. And then the r squared. You know, again, as we mentioned earlier, the r squared doesn't tell us all that much. That's really that interesting for a study, but it's always going to be included. Okay, so rows are your independent variables. And then the columns are the different models that you're going to test. So what does this mean? You can think of models as different sets of assumptions. And so Boulding and Nelson Nunez want to test the effects of participating in civil society organizations, but they think, well, maybe it depends on what kind of civil society organization you participate in. So they're going to look and disaggregate participation by different types of civil society organizations. And these are going to be their different models, okay? So let's look back here, right? So here's model 2, model 3, model 4, model 5. Earlier in the paper, they look at model 1. So here they compare different models. And so look, here's model 2, okay? So here, we're just going to be going down this column. This is all model 2. And what they're doing here is they're saying participation in part of a church group. So that's how they are going to be conceptualizing participation in civil society organization in this model, right? They're only looking at whether you participate in a church group. Model 1 is that when they looked at participation in any kind of group. So that's the first model. And then here is another model that says, no, it's not participation in a church group that matters. Maybe it's participation in a neighborhood association. And that's the real form of civil society activity that's most interesting for our study. So here, once again, these are all the confounds that we look at for participation in a neighborhood association to assess the impact of participation in neighborhood association on support for democratic institutions. Okay, so all these different models reflect different assumptions about which civil society organization would matter. Okay, so now we're going to get to the meat of the regression table, those cells in the middle. So next up, the regression coefficient. And this is to be found in the numbers that are not in parentheses. You go and you look at the row and you find the numbers that are not in a parentheses. Okay, so looking at this once again, remember here are the rows that are the different variables. And here is the regression coefficient. Okay, so this is the regression coefficient for whether people are participating in church groups. And just thinking again about what our regression coefficient tells us, this is the impact of being a member of a church group on your support for democratic institutions. And so we see that it has an impact here. And that, remember, the three things we look at with regression are size, sign, and significance. So here we're able to look at size and sign. It's a positive effect. So being part of a church group has a positive effect on your support for democratic institutions. And we can assess the size. So it's 0.11, right? And so we're looking at a 7-point scale of support for democratic institutions. So being a member of a church group is going to increase your support for democratic institutions by about 0.1. Perception of the economy. Once again, here's the regression coefficient. And your degree of on a 1 to 7 scale, how you view the economy is doing, that's going to have this impact of 0.169 on your support for democratic institutions. And then finally, education. We see this one is negative. So the more education you have, the less your support for democratic institutions will be. Okay, so here are these regression coefficients. Next, so with the regression coefficient, we looked at the number that was not in parentheses. Looking at the number in parentheses, this is the standard error for the regression coefficient. Okay, so looking at this once again, we see this here is the coefficient, and here's that standard error for that coefficient. This means we could come up with a confidence interval for what the true value in the population is for the effect of being a member of a church group. Likewise, we see it for perception of the economy and for education level. Okay, so if you want to come up with a confidence interval, great. And you could do that to assess whether it's statistically significant, but we also have actually the p-values in the regression table, so you don't have to go through that step to decide statistical significance. So the p-values are captured by stars in the regression table. So what does this look like? Okay, let's go down here. And at the bottom of every regression table, you'll have a little code here, and it'll tell you what the stars mean. So here we see if there's 1 star, it means a p-value is less than 0.05. 2 stars means a p-value of less than 0.01. And 3 stars is a p-value less than 0.1. Now you're always going to want to look down here to see what their code is for what the stars mean, because this is actually not, it's not always like this, and in fact usually you want to have more stars, so I would not normally put a p-value of less than 0.1 with 3 stars, but hey, that just means you have to pay attention. Okay, so on the table itself we'll see stars. So up here, right, we see 1 star next to the result. Down here, that means that here's our finding, and that p-value, that this is statistically significant at a 0.05 level. For perception of the economy, this is statistically significant at a 0.01 level. And then finally, for the effect of education, it's not statistically significant at all. So we can't draw conclusions about this. Just something to keep in mind as you're looking at this, always our focus is on up here. This is a main independent variable. And these are just the confounds. These are when we control for ideology, interpersonal trust, political knowledge, etc. Do we still see this impact of being a member of a church group? So really, this is the most important thing to look at to see if there's a star there, because that's the one we really want to see if there is a statistically significant result. So the conclusion that Nelson Nunez and Boulding draw is that there are relationships between participating civil society organizations and supporting democratic institutions. But one, it depends on the type of organization. So we see that there is a statistically significant relationship for church groups, but not for being part of a parents association. There is for neighborhood associations, a community committee, but not for being part of a professional association. So it's going to depend on what kind of participation you're doing, what kind of civil society participation. And the other thing is that these are all positive relationships. So their hypothesis had originally been that if you're part of a civil society organization, we're going to see a negative relationship with supporting democratic institutions. And that's not actually what we see in this data. We see that it's a positive relationship. So even though participating in civil society organizations might make some people more likely to protest, it doesn't mean that they support democratic institutions